The corridor at Lyneham Park was cold even in October, the kind of cold that lived in the stone itself and never quite left regardless of the fires burning in the rooms beyond. Charlotte Wexford, Countess of Lyneham, walked that corridor most mornings without thinking about it. The chill against her ankles, the particular creak of the third board from the east staircase, the way the light came through the high window above the hall table and landed on whatever flowers happened to be arranged there. She knew this house the way she knew a ledger she had not chosen to keep. Every entry familiar, none of it hers. She was carrying a small posy that morning, white freesias and a few stems of late rosemary, gathered by Sophia from the kitchen garden and pressed into her mother's hands with the solemn instruction that grandmother liked flowers. Mama, she said so. Charlotte had said she would deliver them. She was 38 years old, and she had been delivering things in this house for 8 years, and she had stopped expecting gratitude for any of it somewhere around the 3rd year. What she had not stopped expecting, she realized later, was the basic mercy of not being discussed in rooms she was about to enter. The morning room door was half open. She heard Henry's voice before she saw the gap of light. He was saying something about the autumn in a tone she recognized. That particular drawling ease he used with his mother, the voice of a man performing Boredom for an audience of one. Then she heard the dowager's low, practiced laugh, the kind that invited the next remark, and Henry said it. "She bores me, Mother. She always has. But her money doesn't." The dowager laughed again, not surprised, not even particularly amused. The laugh of a woman who has heard this before and found it satisfactory proof of something she already believed. Charlotte did not move. She stood in the corridor with the small posy in her hands and the cold rising through the soles of her shoes, and she listened to the silence that followed the laugh, a silence in which neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing more that needed saying. Behind her, soft footsteps. A parlor maid came around the corner with a breakfast tray, saw Charlotte standing at the half-open door, and looked away with the specific, careful blankness of a servant who has learned that the correct response to what she is witnessing is to have seen nothing. The maid turned down the side passage without breaking her pace. Charlotte watched her go. The household had heard worse than this. The household had calibrated itself around worse than this, had built its silences and its averted faces and its carefully timed entrances around whatever it was that lived between the Earl and his Countess. And it had done so for years, and it would continue to do so, and nobody would say a word. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Charlotte looked down at the freesias in her hands. She thought of Sophia's face when she had pressed them into her mother's palms, the concentrated seriousness of a 6-year-old performing an act of love. She thought of the 30 feet of corridor between herself and the morning room door. She thought of Henry's voice, so perfectly easy, so entirely without self-consciousness. And she understood something that she had perhaps known for some time, but had not yet allowed herself to name. She was not going to walk through that door. She was not going to walk through that door today, and she was not going to walk through it tomorrow. And she was, with great care and considerable precision, going to stop walking through doors she had not chosen. She laid the posy on the hall table, in the fall of light from the high window. She straightened it once. Then she turned and walked directly to her writing desk. Her writing desk was in the small room off the library that had been called, by the dowager, Charlotte's sitting room, said with a faint implication that a woman who required a sitting room of her own was a woman who did not properly inhabit the shared rooms of the house. Charlotte had accepted the description without objection and had, over 5 years, quietly made the room into something else entirely. There was a locked drawer in the lower left of the desk. There was a correspondence box that contained letters from Manchester, from a bank in the city, and from a foreign agent in Lyon, who addressed his letters to Miss C. Whitmore because that was the name under which she corresponded with him, and had done so since her grandfather died, and she had stepped, without announcement, into his place. She sat down. She opened the correspondence box. She took out 3 sheets of paper, and she began, in her clear, unhurried hand, to write 3 letters. The first was to Mr. Alderton in Manchester, her grandfather's senior manager, and now, effectively, hers. She wrote that she would require the quarterly accounts by the end of the following week, and that she wished to discuss the Lyon contract before any further commitments were made. She signed it C. Whitmore and blotted it and set it to one side. The second was to her bank. She wrote that she wished to confirm the arrangements discussed in September, and that the transfer of the specified sum to the account held in her maiden name should proceed as planned. She signed it Charlotte Whitmore Wexford, which was her full legal name and which she almost never used because the household did not know it and the household did not need to. The third letter was to a notary in Como, a man whose name she had been given 6 weeks earlier by the wife of an Italian cloth merchant she had met at a trade dinner in Manchester. One of 3 such dinners she had attended over the past year, traveling under the fiction of visiting an old school friend in Cheshire. The notary's name was Signor Ferrante. She wrote to him in careful French, which was their agreed language, and she asked him to confirm whether the villa above the eastern shore of the lake was still available for an annual lease commencing the following month, and whether the terms they had discussed in September remained as stated. She wrote all 3 letters in under 40 minutes. She sealed them herself, addressed them herself, and placed them in the inner pocket of her correspondence case, which she would take with her on the morning walk to the village post office that she had been taking 3 times a week for the past 2 years. The household believed she walked for her health. Henry had never asked about the walks at all. She sat for a moment after the letters were sealed and listened to the house around her. Somewhere above, she could hear Sophia's voice and the voice of Miss Pryor, the governess, conducting what sounded like a geography lesson. The fire in the grate popped once. From somewhere down the corridor came the distant sound of the morning room door closing, which meant Henry was leaving, which meant the dowager was alone with her tea and her satisfactions. Charlotte placed her hands flat on the surface of the desk. The wood was cool under her palms. She looked at the locked drawer and thought of the 5 years of letters inside it, the 5 years of accounts and contracts and negotiations and decisions, the 5 years of being, in one room of her life, entirely herself. She had built something in that room. She had doubled what her grandfather left her. She had reinvested and expanded and corresponded and calculated, and she had done all of it in silence. And her husband had spent the money with the comfortable ease of a man who believes that a river simply runs. She thought, not much longer. She thought, Tuesday. She unlocked the drawer, took out the Como file, and began to read. 3 weeks passed in the way that the weeks at Lyneham always passed, with the appearance of order and the reality of a household performing itself for an audience of its own members. Charlotte attended every dinner. She sat at the table in the blue dress Henry had once, in the first year, said he liked. And she listened to the conversation and contributed to it when contribution was expected. And she asked after the tenants and remembered the names of the neighbors' children and poured tea with the particular grace that the dowager had spent the first 2 years of the marriage silently correcting. She was a model of what a countess was supposed to be. She had always been a model of what a countess was supposed to be. It was the easiest performance she had ever given, because it required nothing from her that she had not already placed somewhere else. While she attended the dinners, Mr. Alderton sent the quarterly accounts, and she reviewed them in her small room with the door locked, annotated them in the margins, and sent them back. The Lyon contract was confirmed. The bank transfer was completed. Signor Ferrante wrote to confirm that the villa was available, that the terms held, and that he would require her signature on the lease documents within 30 days. She posted her signature on a Tuesday morning during her walk to the village. Sophia, who was perceptive in the way that children are perceptive when they have learned to watch rather than ask, said to her mother one afternoon during their piano practice, "Are we going somewhere, Mama?" Charlotte looked at her daughter's hands on the keys. Small, careful, finding the notes with the deliberate concentration of a child who wants very much to do a thing properly. "We are going to Italy," Charlotte said. "There is a house above a lake, and it has a piano very like this one, and there are lemon trees in the garden." Sophia considered this. "Will Papa come?" "Not at first," Charlotte said, and turned the page of the music. On the morning of the 14th day after the corridor, Henry came down to breakfast to find Charlotte already seated, a cup of tea at her right hand, and a ledger open on the table before her. He stopped in the doorway. He was wearing his riding coat, and he had the look of a man who had received a piece of information he had not yet decided how to arrange. "I have had a rather curious report," Henry said, coming to the table and pouring his own coffee with the practiced ease of a man who has never had to ask for anything. "From Whitfield, at his club. He says he saw you at Alderton's counting house in Manchester 3 weeks ago." "He did," Charlotte said. She did not look up from the ledger. Henry sat down. He looked at his wife with the expression he used when something had surprised him. Not alarmed, not angry, but genuinely, almost academically curious, as though she were an unexpected entry in an otherwise familiar text. "Alderton's," he repeated. "The cotton firm. Your grandfather's old firm." "My firm," Charlotte said. She closed the ledger and turned it so that it faced him, and she set it on the table between them with the flat, deliberate placement of a woman who has been deciding exactly how to do this for 3 weeks and is now doing it without haste. "I have run it for 5 years, Henry, since my grandfather died. 3 managers, 2 foreign agents, a bank account in my maiden name, and a quarterly correspondence that I have maintained from this house, from Manchester, and from wherever else I have needed to be." Henry looked at the ledger. He looked at the columns of figures, the cotton prices, the Lyon margins, the reinvestment line that had, over 5 years, doubled the original capital. He looked at the name at the top of the page. C. Whitmore, Principal. "The money," he said, and his voice had changed. The drawl was gone, replaced by something flatter and more careful. "The money I have been drawing on has been actively earned," Charlotte said. "Doubled, in fact, since you inherited it as dowry. The figure you received at our wedding was approximately half of what it is now. You are welcome to verify it with my bank." Henry set his coffee cup down. He was looking at the ledger with the expression of a man who has walked into a room he thought he knew and found the walls in different places. "I am leaving for Italy on Tuesday," Charlotte said, "with Sophia. I have leased a villa above Lake Como under my maiden name. The firm will continue to operate from Manchester. Mr. Alderton will correspond with me by post." Henry looked up from the ledger. "Charlotte, I am not asking your permission," Charlotte said. "I am informing you of what is happening. You will receive through my solicitor a letter detailing the arrangements I am making. I am not seeking a divorce. I am simply going to live in a way that is accurate to what my life actually is." Henry opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked for a moment, like a man who had reached for the correct tone, the one that worked in every room, with every person, in every situation, and found it simply absent. He had 30 or 40 responses available to him in any given conversation. He was a man of considerable social facility, a man who had never, in Charlotte's memory, been at a loss for the precisely calibrated remark. He sat at the breakfast table with the ledger open in front of him, and he said nothing at all. Charlotte stood. She folded her hands. She looked at him for a moment, at the riding coat, at the coffee cup, at the face she had been looking at for 8 years without ever quite being seen in return. And then she walked out of the room and left him alone with the figures. Within 10 days, the nature of the Countess's absence had become clear to everyone at Lyneham who had eyes to see. The schoolroom was empty. Miss Pryor had been given a character reference and a month's wages. 2 trunks had been taken down from the upper storage and packed with the careful efficiency of a woman who has been deciding what matters for longer than anyone realized. Sophia's wooden animals, a menagerie of 12, acquired one by one over 6 years, were wrapped in flannel and placed in a small traveling case that Sophia herself carried onto the Dover train with both hands. They sat together in the railway carriage as the Kent countryside moved past the windows, flat and gray in the October light. The fields already stripped, the hedgerows dark. Sophia had arranged 4 of the wooden animals on the seat beside her and was conducting a quiet conversation between them about the journey. Charlotte watched her daughter's profile, the particular angle of her chin, which was Henry's, and the particular way she concentrated, which was nobody's but her own, and felt the landscape pulling them south and east toward the water. It was in the carriage between Dover and Calais, alone, Sophia asleep against her shoulder, the wooden animals settled in their case, that Charlotte allowed herself the 7 minutes. She did not plan them. They arrived without announcement, the way grief arrives when the body finally understands that something is over. She wept quietly, her face turned toward the window, one hand covering her mouth. She wept for the marriage that had never been what she had believed. At 30, it might become. She wept for the night of Sophia's birth, 6 years earlier, when Henry had come into the room after the doctor left and had stood for a long time beside the bed. And then, she had been almost asleep, barely conscious of him, had placed his hand on her hair. Not a gesture she had invited. Not a gesture he had ever made before. She had woken just enough to see his face in the candlelight, and his face had been unguarded in a way she had never seen it. And she had thought, in the soft, blurred way of exhaustion, perhaps it will become something real. He had not repeated the gesture. She had waited, in the years that followed, without quite admitting to herself that she was waiting. She wept for that, and for the girl who had entered this marriage at 30 believing that competence and patience were sufficient foundations, and for the 6 years of Sophia's life that had passed in a house where her mother was invisible and her father was performing. 7 minutes. Then she straightened, took the handkerchief from her sleeve, pressed it once to each eye, and put it away. She opened the correspondence case on her lap. The autumn cotton figures were on top, Mr. Alderton's careful hand moving down the columns. She began to read. By the time the French coast appeared through the window, she had annotated 4 pages and drafted a reply in the margins. The villa above Lake Como was built of pale stone and had a terrace that faced west, so that the evenings were full of light off the water. There were lemon trees in pots along the terrace wall, as Charlotte had promised Sophia. And there was an upright piano in the drawing room that had been tuned recently enough to be serviceable. And there was a view from the upper windows that Sophia declared, on their first morning, to be the best view she had ever seen in her life. She said this with the authority of a 6-year-old who has decided something and sees no reason to be uncertain about it. Charlotte hired a cook, a housemaid, and a local woman named Signora Bianchi, who proved, within a fortnight, to be entirely indispensable. She enrolled Sophia with a tutor named Professore Ricci, who came 3 mornings a week and had the patience of a man who genuinely enjoyed teaching, which Sophia recognized immediately and responded to with complete devotion. In the evenings, after supper, Charlotte sat with Sophia at the upright piano, and they worked through the pieces they had been learning at Lyneham, slowly, patiently, Sophia's small hands finding the intervals while Charlotte's right hand filled in the bass. Mr. Alderton wrote twice weekly. Charlotte replied by return post, her annotations filling the margins of his letters until there was no white space left, and she posted them back with additional pages when the margins ran out. The Lion agent wrote in November, with a complication involving a shipping delay. Charlotte resolved it in 2 letters and a firm instruction to the bank. She was, in this room of her life, completely herself. In London, the Dowager Countess of Lyneham held her regular Tuesday tea. She was a woman who understood that information, in the right hands, was simply another form of currency, and she spent it with the same calculation that she applied to everything else. The story she planted at the tea table was precise in its details and generous in its sympathy. Her daughter-in-law had suffered a nervous collapse. The strain of her responsibilities, the isolation of her position, the fragility that had always been, one had suspected, just beneath the surface. It was a shame. It was not unexpected. It circulated through 3 clubs within a fortnight, carried by the particular velocity that attaches to stories about women who have behaved in ways that require explanation. Henry heard it at his own club, from a man who told it with the tone of someone conveying condolences. He went directly from the club to his mother's house in Mayfair. The Dowager was in the drawing room with her embroidery, and she looked up at his entrance with the expression of a woman who has been expecting this visit and has prepared accordingly. "The story at Whitfield's table," Henry said without sitting down. "That Charlotte has had a collapse. Did you plant it?" The Dowager set down her embroidery. "I protected the family's reputation," she said. "An absent countess requires some accounting. I provided one that was sympathetic." "You invented an illness," Henry said. "I provided a narrative that reflects well on no one and harms no one," the Dowager said, "which is more than your wife's behavior has managed." Henry looked at his mother for a long moment. The Dowager met his gaze with the composure of a woman who has, over 40 years, learned that her son's silences are the price of her security and that they always end the same way. He would say what he had come to say, and then he would leave, and the matter would be closed. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. He left without arguing. He went to his study and sat at his desk for a long time, and then he took out a sheet of paper and wrote to Charlotte in Como. The letter was 3 pages long and contained, among other things, a request for her to understand his position, several observations about the difficulty of the situation, and one sentence near the end that said he hoped Sophia was well. He posted it and waited. Charlotte did not answer. He wrote again, shorter this time, the observations reduced to 2 paragraphs. She did not answer that either. He wrote a 3rd time, 1 page formal, asking only whether she and Sophia were in good health. She did not answer. The 4th letter was different. He wrote it on a Sunday evening in November when the house was empty and the fire had burned down and he had been sitting for an hour at his desk without writing anything. When he finally began, the sentences came out smaller than anything he had written in his adult life. He wrote that he had been sitting with her grandfather's ledger the one she had left on the breakfast table, and that he had been looking at the figures for some time. He wrote that he had not known. He wrote and then crossed out several attempts at explaining why he had not known, because each attempt sounded, on rereading, like an excuse. And he was beginning to understand that he did not have excuses that were worth the paper. He wrote plainly that he had spent 8 years in a house with a woman who had built something extraordinary, and he had not once asked her a single question about how she spent her time. He did not ask her to come back. He did not ask her to forgive him. He simply said that he had not known, and that not knowing was not something he could any longer treat as neutral. Charlotte read this letter twice. She set it on her writing desk and looked out the window at the lake, gray and still in the November afternoon, and she read it a third time. Then she put it in the locked drawer with the Manchester correspondence, which was not where she put the letters she intended to discard. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in December, carried up from the village by Signora Bianchi, along with a week's post and a bunch of late-season fennel from the market. It was addressed in a hand Charlotte did not recognize, and it was sealed with the Lyneham crest, which was unusual because Henry's letters came under his personal seal. The return address was that of a solicitor's office in London. The sender was named as the estate of the late Mr. Edmund Wexford, Henry's uncle, who had died in October. Charlotte opened it at her writing desk after Sophia had gone to bed. Inside was a single folded document, 3 pages in a clear legal hand, and a brief covering note from the solicitor explaining that the letter had been written and sealed before Mr. Edmund Wexford's death, with instructions that it be delivered to Lady Charlotte Wexford and to no one else upon the conclusion of the estate. She began to read. Edmund Wexford had written plainly, in the manner of a man who has decided that the time for careful language has passed. He began by saying that he was writing to her because he believed she was a woman of sufficient intelligence and steadiness to do something useful with what he was about to tell her, and that he had not written to Henry because Henry, in his judgment, would not yet be able to hear it from a living person. He wrote that he had been watching his nephew for 22 years, and that what he had watched was a man destroying himself in the service of a secret he should never have been asked to carry. He explained what Henry had found at 19. His mother's correspondence, 40 years of it, kept in a locked box in her dressing room that Henry had found while looking for a piece of jewelry she had asked him to retrieve. The letters from the family solicitor, a man named Reeves, who had died when Henry was 23. The particular tenor of those letters, not merely an affair, but a sustained devotion, and within it, explicit and unmistakable, the truth of Henry's birth. Edmund wrote that Henry had come to him that same week, 19 years old, the letters in his coat pocket. He had sat in Edmund's study and had not wept, had been, in fact, so entirely controlled that Edmund had found it more alarming than weeping would have been. Henry had said that he was not going to tell his mother he had found the letters, because to tell her would be to destroy the one arrangement that kept the family intact, and he was not willing to do that. Edmund had argued. Henry had listened, and then said, with the particular finality of a young man who has already decided, "I am the only person who can protect her from this, and I am going to do it, and I am never going to speak of it again." He had not. For 22 years, Edmund wrote, Henry had performed the role of his mother's devoted, indifferent, bored, aristocratic son, and he had done it so thoroughly that he had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that the performance was not the man. He had learned contempt from his mother because contempt was the mask she wore, and he had worn it too, because the alternative was intimacy, and intimacy meant the risk of someone seeing what he was actually carrying. He had married Charlotte because she seemed, at the wedding, like a woman who would not press. He had not foreseen, Edmund wrote, with what appeared to be a dry affection, that she would turn out to be the most capable person in the room. Charlotte sat at her writing desk and read all 3 pages, and then sat without moving for a long time. The fire had burned low. The lake outside was invisible in the dark. Upstairs, she could hear the particular silence of a sleeping child, which is different from any other kind of silence. She thought about 8 years. She thought about a man who had learned, at 19, to build a wall, and had spent the next 22 years perfecting it until the wall and the man were indistinguishable. She thought about the morning room at Lyneham, the practiced laugh, the line delivered with such complete ease, and she understood, for the first time, that it had not been ease at all. It had been a man who hated himself for protecting a woman who had taught him cruelty, speaking his self-contempt aloud in the one room where his mother had first taught him to perform it. She did not sleep. By the time the sky began to lighten over the lake, she had made a decision. She put the letter inside her coat, against her chest, and walked down the hill to the village. The inn was a small place, stone-built, with a low door and a proprietor who had grown accustomed, over the past several weeks, to the English lord in the corner room, who paid promptly and asked for nothing except quiet. Charlotte knocked at the door of that room at 6:30 in the morning. Henry opened it after a moment, still in his shirt sleeves, and saw her face. He said nothing at all. "Something has reached me," Charlotte said, "concerning your uncle. You must read it yourself. I don't know yet what to do with it." She took the letter from inside her coat, where she had been holding it against her ribs for the length of the walk down the hill, and she held it out. Henry reached for it, and as he took it from her hands, his fingers closed briefly around hers. Not deliberately, she thought, or perhaps not entirely deliberately, but with a pressure that lasted 3 seconds before she drew her hand back. He did not acknowledge it, neither did she. "I'll be at the villa," she said, and turned and walked back up the hill alone. Charlotte wrote Henry 1 page, 2 days after the morning at the inn. She wrote that a letter existed concerning his uncle, that she would not discuss its contents in correspondence, and that his presence was required in England within 10 days. Specifically, in his mother's morning room at the Lyneham townhouse. She wrote that she would travel to London, and that she expected him to accompany her. She signed it C. Wexford, and sent it by the morning post. What she did not know, when she sent that letter, was that the Dowager had already begun to move. The Dowager had spent the past 2 months watching her son's correspondence with the careful attention of a woman who has never stopped treating her household as a terrain to be managed. She had noted the 4 letters to Como. She had noted, with more alarm, that the 4th had been different in length and tone from the first 3. She understood, with the instinct of a woman who has spent 40 years reading the signals in a room, that she was losing her son's long silence, and that losing it meant losing the one weapon she had always held without needing to brandish. She instructed the family solicitor, a younger man now, Reeves's successor, who knew the shape of the arrangement without knowing its history, to prepare a petition challenging the Countess's fitness to retain the child Sophia abroad. The grounds were thin: foreign residence, the absence of English schooling, the instability implied by the planted story of a nervous collapse. Legally, it was nearly worthless. Publicly, it was not worthless at all. It would confirm to anyone who read it that the Countess was a woman whose judgment had been called into question by her own family. It would make the planted story official. Henry learned of the petition from his own solicitor before the ink was dry on the filing. He came to his mother's house in Mayfair that afternoon and was shown into the drawing room. where the dowager was waiting with the composure of a woman who has prepared 3 arguments and expects to need all of them. Henry stood in the center of the room and said without raising his voice, "You will instruct Pemberton to withdraw the petition." "The petition is a protective measure," the dowager said. "Your daughter is being raised in a foreign country by a woman who has—" "By her mother," Henry said, "who is raising her very well, by every account I have." He looked at his mother steadily. "You will withdraw the petition. Today." "Henry, the family's position requires—" "I am withdrawing my support," Henry said, "from the petition and from whatever comes after it. I should have said this to you some time ago, and I am saying it now. You will not take action against Charlotte or Sophia, not through the solicitor, not through the tea table, not through any other means available to you." He paused. "I am asking you once, plainly, because I think you deserve to be asked plainly before I act without asking." The dowager looked at her son. She tried the first argument, which concerned the family's reputation. Henry did not engage with it. She tried the second, which concerned Charlotte's suitability. Henry looked at the floor and waited for her to finish. She tried the third, which was the one she had been saving. A softer version, almost maternal, about what she had done and continued to do for his sake, for the family's sake, for the sake of everything they had maintained together. Henry listened to this one all the way through, and when she finished, he said, "I know what you have done. I have known for 22 years. I am not exposing it, but I am finished carrying it." The dowager went very still. Henry sent word to Pemberton that afternoon. The petition died before it reached a single judge. The following week, Charlotte and Sophia arrived in England. Charlotte went alone to the Lyneham townhouse on the evening before the morning room scene, leaving Sophia upstairs with a maid. And she sent word to the dowager that she would call at 7 o'clock. The dowager received her in the morning room, the same chairs, the same fire in the same grate. The freesias on the hall table had been replaced by hothouse roses, which was the only difference Charlotte noticed. She sat down across from the dowager, without being invited to sit, and she placed her hands in her lap, and she said, "I know what is in the letter your brother-in-law left for me." The dowager's face did not change. It was a face that had been trained over 60 years not to change. "I know what Henry found when he was 19, Charlotte said. "I know what he chose to do with it, and I know how long he has carried it, and I know why his face has been a wall for the entirety of our marriage." She looked at the dowager steadily. "I am not here to make threats. I am not here to make arrangements. I am here because I thought you should know, before tomorrow, that your son's silence has had a witness all these years. The witness is dead, but the knowledge is not." The dowager sat very still. Charlotte watched her understand it, watched the calculation running behind those composed eyes, the assessment of what Charlotte knew and what she intended to do with it, and whether it could be managed. And then she watched something else. The moment when the dowager understood that it could not be managed, because Charlotte was not seeking anything that could be offered in exchange for silence. Charlotte was not seeking anything at all. She was simply telling the truth of what she knew, in the room where it had been kept longest. Charlotte stood. She said good night. She walked back through the corridor, past the hall table with its hothouse roses, and returned to the stripped townhouse and her sleeping daughter. She sat at her writing desk for a long time without writing anything. The fire burned. The house was quiet. She thought about Henry at 19, finding the letters, making his choice, She thought about 22 years of a face kept carefully empty. She thought about the night of Sophia's birth and the hand on her hair, and the one moment she had believed it might become real. And she understood now that in that moment it had been real, or had tried to be, and that the man who had placed his hand on her hair had been, briefly, the man beneath the performance, and that the performance had closed over him again by morning because he had never learned that there was anywhere safe to put it down. She did not sleep well, but she slept. The Dowager had summoned Henry to the morning room at 10 o'clock, and Henry had come because Charlotte had asked him to. And the Dowager did not yet know that those two facts were connected. She sat in her usual chair with her usual composure and waited for her son to arrive so that she could discuss, with him, the question of the absent Countess and how the matter might best be managed going forward. She found, instead, that Charlotte was already there. Charlotte was seated in the chair nearest the window. Not the chair a guest would choose, but the chair of someone who had arrived first and chosen her position deliberately. The morning room door was fully open behind her. On the low table between the chairs, face down, was a folded letter. The room was very quiet. The fire was burning. Outside, the London street carried its usual sounds, and none of them entered. The Dowager stopped in the doorway. She looked at Charlotte, and then at the letter, and then at Charlotte again. "Sophia is upstairs," Charlotte said. "She is perfectly well." Henry arrived 3 minutes later, coming through the open door to find his wife seated and his mother standing, and the letter on the table between them. He looked at Charlotte. Charlotte picked up the letter and held it out to him, not to the Dowager, who was the closer of the two, but to Henry, deliberately, across the room. Henry crossed to her and took it from her hands. He did not sit. He stood by the window and unfolded the 3 pages and read them. And the room was silent except for the fire and the street and the sound of the pages turning. The Dowager watched her son's face. Charlotte watched the Dowager watching. When Henry finished, he folded the letter. He held it for a moment, looking down at it. Then he set it on the table, face down as it had been, and he turned to his mother. "I found the letters when I was 19, he said, "in your dressing room. I was looking for the pearl earrings you asked me to fetch for the Ashworth dinner." He said this without particular inflection, as though he were recounting a fact from a ledger. I read enough to understand. I put them back and I said nothing, because I thought that was what was required of me. The Dowager said, very carefully, "Henry." "I am not finished," Henry said. And his voice was quiet, but it was not the quiet of a man who will be interrupted. "I carried it for 22 years. I carried it through my father's death and through Reeves's death and through my own marriage and through every conversation in every room of every house we have shared. And I carried it because you taught me, from the time I was small, that the correct response to anything that might damage the family's position was silence." He looked at his mother. "I am finished carrying it. I am not going to expose you. I am not going to take the letter to anyone who would use it. But I am releasing myself from the obligation to protect you from a truth that was yours to manage, not mine." The Dowager sat down. It was the first time Charlotte had ever seen her sit down without intending to. Henry turned to Charlotte. He looked at her for a moment, at the woman across the table, the woman who had read his uncle's 3 pages and walked down a hill in the dark and handed him the letter, and then walked back up alone, who had sat in this room the previous evening with his mother and said what needed saying without threat or performance, who had run a firm for 5 years from a locked drawer in a room he had never thought to enter. "I don't know how to ask your forgiveness," he said, I don't think I have the standing to ask it. What I want to ask, what I am asking, is whether you will allow me to come to Como in the spring." He stopped. He looked at the letter on the table and then back at her. "Not to resume something. Not as the husband you were assigned. I would like to come as a man who wants to learn his daughter and who would like, if you are willing, to earn the right to know the woman he never noticed he had married." The room was very quiet. The dowager did not move. The fire settled. Charlotte looked at Henry for a long moment. She looked at his face, at the face she had been looking at for 8 years, which had always been, she understood now, a wall with a man behind it, and which was not a wall at this moment, but simply a face, tired and plain and waiting. She picked up the letter from the table. She folded it carefully along its original creases. She put it in her bag. "We will discuss the terms," she said, "when you have heard them." The following morning, the stripped London townhouse was full of the particular bustle of departure. Trunks in the front hall, Sophia's traveling case of wooden animals already clasped and ready, the sound of Sophia herself on the upper landing asking whether Italy was still there. To which the housemaid replied with great patience that yes, Italy was still there. Henry arrived at 9 o'clock. He came through the front door and found Sophia on the stairs, and he went to her immediately, knelt down in the front hall, his coat spreading on the cold tiles, and took his daughter's hands in both of his. Sophia looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of a child who is deciding something. "Are you coming to Italy?" she asked. "Not yet," Henry said. "But I hope to come in spring, if your mother agrees." Sophia considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "The lemon trees will be better in spring," she said, which appeared to settle the matter to her satisfaction. She kissed her father on the cheek, a small, deliberate kiss, placed with great care, and then went back up the stairs to supervise the final packing of the wooden animals. Henry stood. When he turned, Charlotte was closer than he had expected. She had come down the stairs behind Sophia without his hearing her, and she was standing an arm's length away in the cold front hall with her coat already buttoned and her gloves in her hand. And she was looking at him with an expression he did not have a name for because he had not seen it before. She stepped forward and placed her hand against his jaw, her palm warm against the cold of the morning. And she kissed him once, slowly and deliberately, the way a person kisses someone they have decided to be honest with. Not a restoration, not a forgiveness, something that had not existed before and was beginning now. She stepped back. "You may come to Como in late May," she said. "You may not write before then. You are to spend the winter at Lyneham and decide, without performance and without audience, who you are." She looked at him steadily. "I am not asking you to become someone else. I am asking you to find out whether there is someone there." Henry nodded. He did not negotiate. He did not reach for the tone that would make the moment more manageable or more elegant or more anything than what it was. He simply nodded and picked up his hat from the hall table and opened the front door himself. "Charlotte," he said, turning back once. She met his eyes. "Yes." "The ledger," he said. "The one you left on the breakfast table. I have been looking at it since October. The lion margins in the 3rd year. How did you manage the exchange rate?" Charlotte looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "Write to Mr. Alderton," she said. "He will explain it." She closed the door behind him. Winter came down on Lyneham the way it always did, hard and gray, the fields frozen, the house cold in its bones. Henry moved through the rooms of his estate and found himself, for the first time in his memory, not performing for anyone. There was no one to perform for. The dowager remained in London. The neighbors called twice, and he received them, and they left, and he did not pursue the invitations they extended. He ate his dinners alone and sat by the fire in the evenings, and he read, which was not in itself unusual, except that what he read were the books on Charlotte's abandoned shelves in the small room off the library, books he had walked past for 8 years without opening. The spines cracked when he opened them. Several of them contained her marginal notes, small and precise, the handwriting of a woman who read with the same careful attention she brought to a ledger. He read the notes as carefully as he read the text. By February, he had worked through most of the shelf. In Como, Charlotte ran the firm, taught Sophia music, and slept without dreaming of England. The winter was mild enough that the terrace was usable on clear afternoons, and she developed the habit of taking her afternoon correspondence there. Sophia drawing at the other end of the table while Charlotte annotated Mr. Alderton's letters. They were, the two of them, entirely sufficient to each other. And Charlotte noticed this with a satisfaction that was clean and uncomplicated. She had not known, before this year, what it felt like to live in a house that was entirely hers. Spring arrived at the lake in the way spring arrives there. Suddenly, extravagantly, the water changing color overnight from gray to a deep and luminous blue. The lemon trees on the terrace put out new growth. Sophia turned 7 on a Thursday in late May, and the occasion was marked by a small ceremony at the village chapel. Just Charlotte and Sophia and Professore Ricci and Signora Bianchi, and, standing at the back of the chapel with his hat in his hands, Henry, who had arrived at the village inn 3 weeks earlier and had been visiting daily since. Walking up the hill each morning and spending the hours between breakfast and supper with Sophia, learning the wooden animals and their names and their established characters, learning the pieces she was working on at the piano, learning the Italian words she had acquired over the winter with the unself-consciousness of a child who does not yet know that languages are supposed to be difficult. Charlotte had watched him learn her daughter and had not said much. She had made tea and brought it to the terrace and listened to the two of them at the piano, Sophia correcting her father's fingering with cheerful authority. And she had thought about what it meant to see a man without his mask for the first time after 8 years of the mask, and whether what was underneath was someone she wanted to know. She had decided that it was. After the chapel ceremony, she invited him to the villa for dinner for the first time. They ate on the terrace as the light faded over the lake, Sophia talking at length about the wooden animals' opinions of Italy. And after Sophia was asleep, Charlotte poured 2 glasses of wine, and they sat on the terrace in the dark and talked. Not about the morning room, not about the dowager, not about Manchester or ledgers or the 22 years he had carried in silence. They talked about the books on her shelf. He had opinions about 3 of them that surprised her. She told him so. He said that he had had a great deal of time to think over the winter, and that thinking, it turned out, was more interesting when there was no one watching. She said that she had found the same thing. The lake was very still, and the lemon trees were silver in the moonlight, and the piano in the drawing room was open, its keys visible through the glass doors. She did not ask him to leave. Morning came through the villa shutters in long bars of pale gold, lying across the stone floor of the terrace. 2 cups of coffee on the low table, steam rising in the cool air. From the drawing room, the sound of the open piano. Sophia, already awake, already at the keys, working through the left hand of the piece she had been practicing for a week. On Charlotte's writing desk, just inside the glass doors, a fresh page lay in the morning light. A quarterly letter to Mr. Alderton in Manchester, the columns neat, the figures clear, signed at the bottom in her own hand. Charlotte Whitmore, Wexford, Principal. With the easy authority of a woman who has been signing her own name in her own rooms for 5 years and intends to go on doing so. Beside it, on the corner of the desk, was the uncle's letter. Charlotte had resealed it in fresh wax the evening before, pressing her own seal into the warm surface. On the front, in her clear and unhurried hand, she had written, "For Sophia Wexford, to be opened on her 25th birthday." Below that, in smaller letters, "This is the family you were born into. Your father and I will tell you, before then, what we made of it." The coffee steamed. The piano played. The lake lay still and blue below the terrace wall, and the lemon trees moved slightly in the early air. And the morning was entirely ordinary, which was, Charlotte thought, exactly what she had wanted.